Hey, everybody. Well, you're in for a treat today. This is my interview with Christopher Trevilla, another of my cohort members. And man, editing this video, I realized it was an even more interesting talk than it occurred to me at the time. When I'm doing these talks, I've got to think about, is the thing recording? Is the sound working? All that stuff. What are my questions? All that stuff like that. And it's only maybe in the edit that I can go, wow, that's a really interesting point that we're talking about. Christopher has such a fascinating background that you're going to hear about. His work with, in the healthcare world in California is fascinating, and his rise up through the ranks is also quite incredible. He's certainly a man with wide and varied interests. I mean, to go from the seminary to the C-suite is incredible. I hope you enjoy this, and I'm going to come back afterwards. I don't want to spoil it now, so I'm going to talk about all the good stuff afterwards. Bye for now. Well, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Yes, of course.
So you're in the same cohort as me, so that means you're enjoying the economics presentation thing?
I am. I'm actually just, I wanted to give myself an off day because I've been prepping with studies for the exam, and then I'll have a nice rest tonight, wake up refreshed while my little ones and my wife sleep in the early morning, have my cup of coffee, take my exam, and then I'll be done with it.
All right. Yeah, I did it. It took a while to do. I will say that.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a little more nuanced than the accounting one was.
So. Yeah, because it's not numbers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah. I wanted to talk to you because, well, you have an interesting background, which I'm curious to know more about. And maybe you could just walk me through what it is you're doing now.
Yeah. I am currently a C-suite senior leadership executive, and I guess you could say a middle to a mid-size health and human services provider, primarily concentrated in the Western United States, that specializes in services of different healthcare services and direct supports for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I've been in the field of what they call developmental services for the better part of about almost 20 years now.
Wow. And how did you come about to get into that? I mean, is that something that you were young and said, I want to do that?
Well, I was born a little different. I am a little different myself. In all cards on the table, I had an individual education plan, which is kind of the California educational standard, saying that this is a student, a young child with unique needs. I had some speech and language challenges very young, and I had and still have vision issues and spatial and vision issues, which I wear pretty specialized contact lenses to address and do have a certain daily regimen to address. But having been acutely familiar with being the other, following my collegiate studies, I was looking into throwing my hat into education, and I was an educator in the primary grades for parochial schools here in LA, Los Angeles County, California, until I was presenting with a young boy who shall remain unnamed, but he presented unique needs, which he had been now to about 2 or 3 schools, parochial schools, because his family didn't want him to attend public schools, but he was not doing well. He was not adapting socially among his peers. He was having some definitely cognitive challenges with speech and socialization. And it really kind of deconstructed a lot of my preconceived, freshly minted out of college notions of being like a Dead Poet Society teacher and really just coming undone, right? And really molding myself to that young person. I'm happy to say that person at the end of that year was more sure of themselves, had never lacked for a grasp of the science and mathematics, but had more grasp of communicative expressive abilities.
Mm.
It had even joined the school soccer team and had made long-standing friendships. That started a trajectory into myself going into the field by working as a direct support person. I left the teaching profession. I went to work at a summer camp for special needs adults and children's in Malibu, California, beautiful Malibu, California. It was run by an agency that used to be called the Crippled Children's Society, but
Right.
was rebranded as Ability First, and worked there several summers until I said, you know what, I want to work on this field, and the rest is kind of history. And slowly have worked my way up to my current position as director of compliance for Redwood Family Care Network.
So walk me through, if you don't mind, going in kind of, I guess is what I would call a face-to-face person,
Mm-hmm.
Dealing with, what do you want to call them, clients or customers or whatever, kids or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Going from that and working your way up to what I imagine now is not a face-to-face position, but is an institutional position where you're in the office. So how did that path work for you?
Yeah. So from a very young age, I had always kind of discerned in a personal had always been discerning like a path as a kind of like a priest, a pastor, mentor. So I've always had and gravitated towards, I guess if you look at the personality types, like the visionary leadership style of kind of personality types, built on social relationships and things like that. And so I found myself, as rewarding and fulfilling as it was with direct care, and as effective as I was, I found a lot more satisfaction being a mentor to peers and learning and expanding the network of people that could work with these folks, and building on those coalitions to better serve them in greater quantity and in a greater cadence and frequency. And so I gained a lot of insights. I took a lot of lumps, a lot of scars, a lot of missteps. Decided that I would at one point pivot from direct service to state bureaucracy through the California Developmental Services Department with the regional center system. Worked as a case manager for about a decade. Did a lot of good there, but I felt that I needed to kind of go back to the direct provider community and really become more involved. So I left a very comfortable position, joined up with a company then called People's Care, and began running a behavior management program with some very significantly challenged adults needing a lot of support to kind of become productive, contributing member society, to manage their behaviors, develop skills, and develop their independence. Rewarding set of years. Brought a lot of success and stability to that program. And then I was tapped into operations management at that point to not only stabilize day service supports, but also residential or independent living supports in LA County as a whole. And it was the most demanding and most rewarding time of my life, serving in that capacity for about several years, specifically during the beginning and onset of the pandemic, and making sure that the 68 individuals, adults, children, and seniors that were under my care in different congregate care settings remained safe, alive, and well, and stable during that period of time. So I oversaw an operation that represented about 68 to 72 individuals, which roughly meant I oversaw at least probably about 638 employees, so it was quite a sizable organization.
Wow.
That I oversaw in Los Angeles County and parts of Orange County too. So from there, it's developed a lot of systems and procedures and practices that scaffolded against what the company was doing. And of course, at that point, as economics go, a private equity group saw the opportunity to expand healthcare services, specifically in the developmental services sector, and decided to make a play in California first by acquiring a top-level performing IDD per service provider, in this case, People's Care, and Webster Equity Group, which formed Redwood Family Care Network, began its first acquisition with People's Care. And at that point, I was tapped to become the director of compliance.
Like that to me is an amazing progression, and so clear. I'm sure it wasn't clear in the moment, but to go from that beginning to go to where you are, like that's an amazing, almost classic kind of progression. I feel, and it's remarkable to me, to be honest, and I think it's incredible. But my question would be, you did all that 20 years, amazing stuff, and now you're taking an MBA?
Yes, and the natural so there were many reasons why I put off. I got my bachelor's in 2002. I went to I graduated from high school fairly young at 17, youngish, and I went right into, again, discerning whether I was going to be a priest or not. Instead of going to the seminary, I was advised to go to Thomas Aquinas College here in California. Mm-hmm. And in a nutshell, their curriculum was called the Great Books curriculum, the Great Books of Western Society. And so it was run by intellectuals like Mortimer J. Adler, who founded like Encyclopedia Britannica, if you remember those days. And so they had me read like the economics. Like right now we're taking economics. I read Wealth of Nations. I read a lot of the original texts and things like that, and discourses. And so that was all well and good, but I was too young to appreciate the intellectual rigors of that time. And so I checked out. I graduated by the mercy of God and good fortune and just, grit. But I decided that I wasn't going to be an academic. And my trajectory in direct human services kind of solidified that. Having then been tapped as director of compliance, seeing the foundational and very important role that I've had to do these last year and a half to almost 2 years in guiding senior management, senior leadership through leadership tactics to sound business decisions, risk management, all those things in a very changing landscape, made it clear to me that I needed a more solid understanding of foundational principles of business and enterprise, especially because, again, one always has a dream inside them that lives them, and they work that dream. And of course, my dream doesn't end at just being a director of compliance. I'm actually looking at possibilities in the near or short-term future of even being the executive of my own company, or either that or being tapped to do that, and having the pedigree, the acumen, the experience, and the education all serves to that purpose.
It's interesting. I'm going to a little bit, I think, put words in your mouth, but I've done quite a few of these interviews now, and I think a common thread is that a lot of us, we're not necessarily learning anything. This sounds bad, I think. We're not necessarily learning anything, but we are kind of learning the terminology and, learning how to kind of walk the walk of that. But because a lot of us, myself included, and definitely you, we've probably had all of these experiences. We have some experience with accounting. We have some on the ground experience with economics and everything like that. But for the people I'm interviewing and for myself, there's a lot of inner confidence or inner validation that's going on, and I'm just wondering, is that kind of what you're talking about? Like, it, but now you can say, look, I know it.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I can tell you that me taking my EMBA is driven by factors. Again, I'm not going to make apologies. I'm a very holistic, spiritually bound person. They're a person that likes to give a lot of thought and consideration to things, driven by relationships. So, just as a bookend, during the heart of the pandemic, where there was a sense of, hopelessness, being lost, I would see it in my children. I would see it in my wife, who was staying at home, protecting the kids, all that, and doing all that. But I urged her and I pushed her to get her MSW, which she just completed, her Master of Social Work with University of Texas Arlington. And she made no apologies because she completed her program last August. As the deadline to apply for Quantic was approaching, she's like, "You're not making any excuses. You're finally getting your MBA now." And And it was just as simple as all that began.
Mhm.
And that said, because um, I felt that I needed to make a realignment in my life to find those sources of validation that kind of recertifies and validates my journey, but also helps tie the hidden strings that maybe was right in front of me, but I wasn't making the connections as to how the trajectory of my life had played out in the experiences I've had, to give them common cause and definition, and understand the walking of that trajectory.
Mhm. Mhm. And so why? Well, I'm not why an MBA, but like, how did you stumble across Quantic?
Yeah, very. I was debating whether it was a master's of public health, or an MBA, and there was a very simple reason for that. I'm very much, as you can see in my trajectory, even when I experience with nonprofits, because I have experience for many years running nonprofits as a president, but in changing social policy for common goods like arts, culture, things like that I spent many years passionately pushing. I'm a man of social cause. uh, I felt strongly about the looking at the landscape of bureaucracy and government and systems and policies, and finding ways to create more effective localized solutions. So I wanted to find a way to kind of create positive social good change that was lasting and it had sense of permanence. So that's why Master of Public Health was appealing.
Yeah.
But the relationship side of my leadership trajectory really was pushing me to an MBA. And I knew that if I went to like an executive MBA, a leadership MBA, I knew that I had to also, and so to speak, stomach the financial, the accounting stuff. But I saw it all as a good because, again, if in me lives a dream to run my own company, oversee my own company of any scale in this arena, I'm very all well and good about the philosophy and the vision and the policy of things, but the underpinnings of running an enterprise, the underpinnings of what come into play in running and scaling a business of that kind, I needed that formation.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it became clear that an EMBA was going to be the way to go, and it was something as simple as scrolling through LinkedIn, and I get ads for EMBAs all the time, and it popped out at me saying get it in a certain amount of months. We have scholarships. This could be your opportunity. And I gotta say that they have a really amazing messaging team at Quantic and outreach
Yep.
apparatus, and they got me, and my wife's like, "That's it. That's your program." Because I told her the name. She's like, "What university?" Quantic. And of course, some people are like, What is that?" My wife's like, "No, that's the one." I'm like, why? Because that's the weirdest sounding one you ever brought up, and so that's definitely the one.
Oh, yeah. I've spoken to a few staff, not off camera kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I said, the name's a bit crazy because it doesn't sound, I said, I kind of like it because it sounds like Star Trek-y,
Yes. Yeah. 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 Exactly. It appealed to that. I'm very much a sci-fi comic book guy, and
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, for me, I have a very different path than you. I'm software developer, and I'm solo entrepreneur for the most part. Though I've done companies, and I had a company based in LA actually, so I know a little bit about LA, and uh, but very different, sector than you and everything like that. But I don't know that I actually know any MBAs. Do you?
I did. I did. There was, as curiously as it was, the California Regional Center System, which was a social work apparatus for developmental services. There were a lot of my peers that had like their masters of social work, their masters of public health, but every once in a while there were one or two that had their MBA, or they were doing their MBA, and there was actually two of my peers that brought up to me like, "Oh, I'm getting my MBA." And I would ask them, well, how was that and why? Well, because they would tell me, quite frankly, I work on the vendor relations side of things, or I work on the accounting rate side of things, where we pay out services to these vendors. We see how much they take home and how much these CEOs get. I want to run my own agency, and have the Regional Center pay me for running that service. I already know again. So again, seeing that all into focus, was bringing that idea to me even then.
I think there's a tendency, maybe it's human nature, I think, but to kind of stay within your pool. And so that's why it's interesting, like to do a master's of public health for me would have been you staying in your pool a little bit, and I think it's those of us who challenge ourselves to go out, like you and me, maybe we're never going to be accountants, hopefully.
Right.
But, we're never going to be accountants, but
Sure.
to know that really broadens us a lot more than if we'd kind of just stuck inside. Like, if I'd not done an MBA, but instead I'd focused on like some software thing or something like that, that would have, made my silo taller. But,
right.
This did a big thing. And I think it's really interesting when people do that, because I think a lot of people don't,
Yeah, I think that we're very risk averse. I think, and we're prone to the seduction of comfort, and I think, in being a student of leadership, whichever mentor speaks to you, whether it's Maxwell or Ziglar or Brené Brown or several of the others that are just amazing, Simon Sinek, there's just so many, right, that are great voices for what leadership is and could look like. They all seem to agree that comfort is the enemy of growth, right? And growth is at the heart of leadership because you're always growing. And I think, in that sense, making a decision to pivot away from an MPA, because I had a few friends in my corner that were saying, no, the Master of Public Health, because that way you can go work at the state and guide the policy of the state and all that. And I found it great, all great and good, if I wanted to limit myself to rising through a trajectory through the system of supports and developmental services in the state of California. But because I wanted to cast a wider net, mirroring kind of what our current company is doing in terms of expanding in Arizona, Nevada, Washington, California, I required a broader, out of my comfort zone approach to education, a more versatile, investment of education and time.
Yeah, I think to expand ourselves, to become more versatile, as you say, that for us, people like us, I think that's the only way really we can accomplish our dreams, because I think our dream is not so much a role, well, no, it's not like being a software developer is not my dream, being a, let's say, a direct care worker was not your dream. We have these wider things, and we need all those tools that we can get to do that. And plus, I think just the idea of growing is satisfying in and of itself as well.
Of course. I mean, we're living in such a interconnected world, right? That you would think that finding one's place would become easier, but it becomes harder because the options seem boundless, and it's easy to lose one's footing or compass, and then letting time pass. And I think that's kind of what when my wife's urging was like, look, you pushed me through, even with COVID, the scariness of COVID, you pushed me to get my MSW. I'm done with it. Now COVID's in the rear. It's still around, but it's in the rearview mirror mostly. It's now time for you to really, become uncomfortable again and finish what you had intended to do so many years ago. Because I had originally gone to a master's education program with the University of Phoenix. I left that within a year. I knew this was not going to be for me. And I went to several come and see, welcome and greet events over the years for MSW, for MBAs, for Master of Public Health, just different ones, but none of them really rung to me. But I gotta say, the targeted campaign and the very impressive communications apparatus at Quantic, they reeled me in.
And I think the staff, I haven't talked to a lot, but those that I've talked to, they're so great.
Yes.
And they do an amazing job of holding our hands in a sense, or not even holding our hands, boosting us, our confidence that you can do it, and treating us like adults, which is nice.
That's amazing. Yes. Yeah. Just
Yeah.
seeing the discussions that come and organically arrive through Slack, the
Mhm.
way it's fostered there through LinkedIn, outside venues like this,
Mhm.
and even just the webinars and the format in there which they're held. I can't say enough about our previous professor in accounting, how great a mentor he was through his calls. I loved it. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a real testament to, I think, the disruption that Quantic wants to make with their model of
Yeah.
instruction. I think it's a welcome development.
Yeah, I don't think that can be understated. I mean, for me, I wouldn't have done an MBA if I couldn't find a program like this, really.
Yeah.
And the tech as well is pretty great, like the app and the way the
Mhm.
learning is done. And I'll tell you, like I bought the microeconomics and macroeconomics books, and not a word of a lie, what we learned in Quantic was in those few card stacks or whatever you want to
Mhm.
call them,
Mhm. Mhm.
was essentially everything that's in that 500-page microeconomics book,
Mhm. Mhm.
which is amazing to me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it's quite incredible. Um, I did want to tell you that another reason why I chose a EMBA was just because I understand where the field is headed. I kind of alluded to it in our communications, but we're going through a real watershed moment in health and human services at a federal and state level, where we're facing strong headwinds due to a contracting labor market. There's less
Mhm.
and less essential workers for health and human services. There's a noticeable skill gap between new workers that are trying to enter the market to work the workforce, and so we're seeing a lot of adverse situations play themselves out, risk increasing, right? And because the end of mitigations and waivers and allowances that were given during the emergency cycle of the pandemic, there's an enhanced sense of scrutiny from state and federal agencies that are really bearing down on the provider community already beleaguered by the challenges in labor. And specifically with California facing now a significant budget deficit and not being able to possibly provide promised funding to supplement and bolster these transit services, it takes a real tight circle of advisors and thinkers of different types in our organization C-suite to meet it head on. We're and all providers of different scales are trying to come to terms with what their next 6, 12, 18-month revenue cycle is going to look like and what their business model is going to look like with everything that's going on.
So do you have, as somebody who's outside of that business, so do you think you've got kind of like three threats to kind of summarize like what you're saying, three threats, like a labor shortage, funding, you know,
Mhm.
retooling for want of a better word. And then I
Mhm.
would imagine also you have an increased demand.
Yes, because we're so short staffed all across the health service sector, the level of patience, frustration, and agitation from the customer base is increasing because they want their services now. They've been waiting. They've been in isolation, seclusion, not being integrated or being served in their home and as effectively. Everything's been virtual for a while, and the onslaught of demand is very hard to meet. And at the same time, our regulatory agencies from the state and federal level are forcing the issue by being a little more, I guess, being a little more forceful with the enforcement of state and federal code. In fact, the healthcare uh, industry is going to be switching to what's being called a value based compensation scale, where it's not just block grants to states for health services carte blanche, but rather it's data driven by results and customer satisfaction and outcomes and that are measured to determine percentage of compensation to scale based on localities and states and municipalities and healthcare partnerships. So the whole nature of the industry is changing quite rapidly.
Hmm. And I mean, on the surface, that doesn't sound like a bad idea
No,
to do it like that,
no, of course not.
but it's only a good idea if you have the ability to meet it, you
Yes,
know?
Yeah.
Like I'm originally from Canada, and in Canada, our healthcare obviously is totally different, but it runs the same thing. And I think, and I know in Japan, actually, where I am now, it's the same. There's a shortage of labor. Few people want to go into these roles, and it's hard to get people in. And you can't treat on one hand, treat it like there's no labor shortage, which is kind of what's happening from a governmental side.
Yeah.
It's really complicated.
It is. It is. It is. And so there are a lot of solutions of the day that are trying to carry the day, but we're all trying to find our footing right now. As a lot of small providers are kind of going belly up, and private equities obtaining them and expanding them. The way I see it is that there's going to be a big push for more mergers and acquisitions from certain targeted acquisitions from private equity, as they try to kind of ensure that these services have some sort of continuity. Um, and in the wake of the pandemic, because the pandemic brought a lot of largesse to health and human services that created artificial gains, artificial economic landscape that now, since removed, not only is the floor collapsing underneath, but the ceiling's falling at the same time.
Yeah. Wow. It's a huge, and I mean, because healthcare on all kinds is kind of such an essential service.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think, it's unfair to hold them to, strict financial and all of that requirements, because it's above that. But on the other hand, it's, we live in a commercial world.
Correct.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think long term, right now, while the transition is very painful and difficult, the transition to a value-based compensation model, where the individual, the patient, the person served, is at the center of all the budgetary and decisions in regards to driving the treatments, the interventions, the supports that health and human services will bring into their lives in and out, will only make our practice more humane, more person-centered, more of what it needs to be to ultimately meet the needs of that person of where they're at, and more acutely so in the world of people with developmental disabilities.
Well, there you go. That's my interview with Christopher Trevilla. So much thank you to Christopher for taking the time. It was incredibly late at night for him and late at night for me. I think that's the way it worked. So maybe that's a bit why I was a bit like that. But isn't that interesting, how this MBA brings together people of such wide and varied backgrounds, but everybody that I've talked to, at least, is really focused on growth. If you go and look at the interviews that I did with Mariana, and many of the other interviews, people talk about how they are doing this mostly, or partly at least, for their own growth, for their own education, because they are interested in learning. I think that that's pretty incredible, and to meet these types of people really kind of motivates me to learn, not only in the MBA, but just to keep on learning and growing in general. I hope you feel the same. Thanks so much for watching. The usual like, subscribe, bell notification. I'll get that right one day. And we'll stick around for some other interviews that I've got coming up. And of course, my general blah, blah about going through this EMBA program with Quantic. Talk to you soon.